Bad documentation can destroy a good decision. In investigations, documentation doesn't just support the case, it is the case. Vague notes, emotional language, and late write-ups don't just weaken discipline, they actually create real risk for retaliation claims, EEOC scrutiny, or even costly lawsuits. In this episode of the HR Investigations podcast, I'm going to break down what documentation must include to hold up under scrutiny and what should never appear in an employee file.
Welcome to the HR Investigations podcast, exploring the issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions. Sponsored by RPCHR and hosted by Natalie Ivy, an HR consultant, licensed PI, and author of the best-selling book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for human resource professionals. And now, here's Natalie.
Welcome back to the HR Investigations podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Ivy, and so glad to have you with me. Today, we're going to be diving deep into one of the most critical elements of any HR investigation, and that is documentation. In investigations, whether it is harassment complaints, performance issues, or even workplace misconduct, look, documentation isn't just supplemental, it is the case. Poorly written manager notes, that can undermine even the strongest evidence, while strong, objective records can really protect your organization and also just demonstrate fairness and good ethics. So today, I'm going to focus on what attendance and discipline documentation really needs to include to really withstand scrutiny from the EEOC, state agencies, courts, or even like internal appeals, especially those of you who have labor unions and have union procedures. Now let's delve into what good documentation looks like. Good documentation, it's timely. Right? It doesn't take a manager 6 months to finally start writing things down. Okay. It's factual. Okay. Not theoretical. And it's objective. And what it does is it describes behavior, not attitude, not intent, or not assumptions. And that's usually where I find a lot of problems are with the way managers are documenting. Let's roll through what key elements really do make documentation defensible. I said earlier, timely. All right, that means you document incidents as soon as possible. And truly, it needs to be within 24 hours while the details are fresh. The delayed notes really raise red flags about retaliation. All right, and also I shared in a previous episode the simplicity of being able to document just simply using an app like Voice Memo on an iPhone. Managers today who say they don't have time to document it is absolute utter nonsense. We have so much technology today to make it easy for them where literally they're going to have their phone with them and they could just simply record it. So if they tell you they can't, nonsense. All right. Other key elements, factual and specific. That means using concrete details. And people who have attended my workshops, if you're listening, you know I say this all the time, dates, times, and details, right? So that means the dates, the times, the location, witnesses, exact words or actions, and observable outcomes. You want to avoid generalizations. I also talk about that in my book when I talk about documentation and investigations. You avoid leaving things at surface level, like she got in her face. What does that mean? It leaves the reader open to interpretation. So in disciplinary documentation, we do the same. We avoid generalizing. Get specific. It needs to be objective. That means you got to stick to what was seen or heard. You could use the STAR method, the situation, task, action, result, and then structure the notes really clearly. All right, those of you in recruiting, the STAR thing is coming back to you, I'm sure. All right, consistent. You got to follow the same format for every employee. Don't deviate. Have a consistent process for how you're doing your documentation. And it also needs to be complete. All right. That means you include what the employee's response was. You need to make note if the employee received any previous warnings, even if they were verbal. Like if you had simply a memo, maybe making a note that you had a previous conversation with an employee. Maybe it was about the employee failing to wear their safety glasses at work, right? And you made a one-off conversation with the employee, like, hey, I'm just giving you a reminder, you got to have your safety glasses on when you come in the shop, something like that. And then steps taken, like any kind of coaching or even training that was offered. Now, let me give you a coaching tip here. You want to train your managers, your supervisors. They need to be writing, meaning documenting if a third party would be reading it without any sort of context, okay? Like a judge, a jury, or an investigator reading it. And ask the question, does this kind of stand alone and tell the full story fairly? Well, let's break it down even further. Let's look at an investigation example. Let's look at a real-world attendance issue. All right, the lousy way to really document this: John has been unreliable with attendance lately. Right, and that's how a lot of times managers are thinking that they're documenting. No, all right. A good version of this with the John scenario here would be written on the same day, and this is what it really does need to say. On January 15th, 2026, John arrived at 9:45 when his scheduled start time for his shift was 8 o'clock without any prior notification. This is the third unexcused late arrival in the past 2 weeks. Previous dates were January 3rd and 10th. I met with John at 10 a.m. this morning. He stated traffic was heavy. I reminded him of the attendance policy, and this was also reviewed with him in his onboarding on April 5th, 2023, and it offered flexible start time coaching if needed. Next occurrence may result in formal discipline. This version is timely, it's specific, and it also includes the employee's explanation. It references your policy, and it also outlines the expectations. This is much stronger evidence if it's going to be scrutinized. Okay, well, now, what is it that really ruins credibility, especially with managers who are acting, if you will, as agents of an employer? Well, certain words and practices can instantly undermine credibility and signal bias or unfairness. Let me share. Judgmental language that's also very subjective, using words like lazy or she has a bad attitude. She always does this. He's never on time, insubordinate, or not a team player. These are red flags. All right. These are really opinions. They're not facts. And then these are the things that really can invite claims of discrimination, especially using like bad attitude. Okay. That could really be used kind of as a mask for bias against individuals who are of a different age, race, national origin, or even disability. So you want to make sure you're avoiding those kinds of words. Exaggerations. Avoid absolutes like always late unless you can prove it with records, right? I have a client that had an employee who was late 62 times. That's almost being always late. I mean, that was pretty darn close. But don't use always or never. Those are pretty extreme unless you can back it up with the facts. Do you have the time and attendance records that if those are pulled in an investigation that you're going to be able to back up the word always or never? All right, late documentation. You don't do any kind of documentation weeks later, all right, and then, retrofitting it for a decision. No, okay? It's got to be very timely. And also be careful of emotional or what I call inflammatory language. Don't write things like, you should know better, or, this is unacceptable behavior, right? That doesn't add value, and that can also appear biased, right? What you could say is the behavior demonstrated this morning is not in line with our organization's policy or does not adhere to our policy. Okay. Now, if there is something that truly is really unacceptable, like customer service, if an employee used profanity with a guest in a hotel, sure. Defining that behavior will not be tolerated. That is unacceptable and is not adhering to our policy and our service delivery standards. Sure. All right. But you need to be very careful of coming across very emotional, like a knee-jerk reaction that the manager has a lot of animosity toward a particular employee. Okay. All right. So let's look at this investigation example. We're going to start out with a lousy version of the documentation, and then we're going to take a look at what it should include. Okay. Poor version would be, Sarah has a terrible attitude and is always slacking off. She's lazy and doesn't care about the team, end quote. Right. This is destroying the manager's credibility. This is all opinion. All right. There are no facts here. There are no dates, times, or details. And an investigator or a judge would definitely see this bias right away. What you want to do here is replace the judgments and replace it with facts. So instead of saying lazy, say employee completed only 60% of assigned tasks by the deadline on, and insert the specific dates, despite reminders. Right? This is really zeroing in, if you will, on observable behavior and outcomes. All right, here's another really lousy example. Just documenting a performance issue months after the fact and without any other kind of contemporaneous notes. Okay, this looks like pretext, especially if the discipline follows a protected complaint. Oh, look out. You are just asking for trouble in the form of an EEOC charge, particularly around retaliation. All right, then let's move on now, and let's also talk about the writing and the writing for the third party, as I said earlier, like a judge, jury, okay, investigator. You always want to write the documentation as if it's going to be read by somebody else, and somebody else who has never actually met the employee, right? And quite frankly, it very well could be somebody who doesn't know the employee at all. All right, so ask yourself, does what I've written here, does it clearly explain the policy violated and why it matters? Does it show fairness? Was the employee really given, if you will, a bit of due process and a chance to explain? All right, you want to do that. And those of you in public sector, this is a really big deal because you have some, in many cases, unique rules, and especially if you have a labor union, you need to follow those. Then also ask yourself, would it survive the scrutiny of the EEOC? Would it survive in a deposition with, kind of a shiny shoed attorney grilling you? Or would it survive in court? Great questions. If your documentation is really relying on assumptions or vague terms, it just doesn't belong in the file. All right, here's a bit of what I call my kind of checklist for managers before really wrapping up the notes. Is the documentation timely? Are all the facts verifiable? In other words, can we back it up with dates, witnesses, any documents? Has the manager avoided opinions or absolutes? Right? If I'm the manager, did I include the employee side? Am I referencing policy and next steps? Good checklist. Now, let's look at an investigation example here. Disciplinary action for a misconduct scenario where an employee just was repeatedly ignoring safety protocols, right? A good version of how to document this would read in this way. On February 5th, 2026 at 2:30 p.m. in the warehouse, employee Tyler Simpson was observed not wearing required PPE, that stands for personal protective equipment, which in parentheses is listed hard hat and safety glasses, while operating a forklift per company safety policy, section 4.2, and Tyra was trained on the policy on 10/2/2023. Witness to this was Supervisor Sarah Herman. I spoke with employee Tyra at 3:00 p.m. She acknowledged simply forgetting her PPE. I provided refresher training and issued a verbal warning, which was documented. Further violations will result in written warning or suspension. All right, this is objective. It's referencing the specific policy, section 4.2 of the safety policy, and shows progressive discipline. This is going to certainly stand up to that kind of scrutiny that I was discussing, whether it was EEOC or whether we are having to deal with an attorney scrutinizing it. So remember, if your documentation doesn't clearly tell the story, somebody else will, whether that's, the employee's attorney, plaintiff's counsel, or in the EEOC, an EEOC investigator, or even a judge in a court case. Strong documentation for employers, it really protects your decisions, it's promoting fairness, and it also helps employees to improve. And by the way, that's the whole point when we're issuing disciplinary action, corrective action, whatever you call it. We're hoping that we get the behavior to change. And that's also something that's very important. If you are not defining specifically the behaviors that need to change, then you're going to have a devil of a time getting them to change. So I want to thank you very much for listening to the HR Investigations podcast. And also, if you've got some questions about documentation gone right or wrong, certainly drop me a note. And also, before we wrap up, I really want to share an opportunity for those of you who want to deepen your skills in how to investigate properly. I have another workshop coming up, and I'm super excited about it. It is February 17th and 18th, virtual, and it's going to be from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Right now, we still have the Premier Access pricing, but that is coming to a close pretty quickly. And when you register during this period, you're going to get also a complimentary copy of my new book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for HR professionals. So that's worth about $70. And by attending, you're also going to earn credits. So if you've already got your certification, either HRCI or SHRM cert, you're going to get 10 credits. And you're going to receive the Certified HR Investigator badge that you can showcase on your LinkedIn and on your professional profile. The workshop is definitely filling up, and so I limit my space in my workshop. So if you do want to attend, I would recommend right after you listen to this episode that you go to the registration link in the show notes and register, because very soon Madison, my assistant, is going to be closing out this particular workshop. All right, that's it for me today. Until next time, and always remember, the best investigation is the one you don't have to do. See ya.
Thanks for joining us today on the HR Investigations Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show with any colleagues who will benefit from our strategies and solutions. For free bonus resources, simply visit hr-investigations.com. And remember, if you'd like some help with improving your investigative skills, or if your organization is in need of an external investigator to help with a case, please get in touch with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.